For decades, Belarus was more than just a neighbor. It was one of Putin's closest allies, its partner in the so-called Union State. Belarus and Russia moved together, spoke together, they even wargamed together. That's why it was borderline unbelievable when Putin's longtime ally, the man who arguably knows him better than anyone else, Alexander Lukashenko, dropped a bombshell threat in a Russian interview. If Moscow thought it could annex Belarus without consequences, it's got another thing coming, and the Belarusian president made sure everyone knew it. Let's tell you all about it. In October 2024, Lukashenko gave an exclusive interview to Izvestia, a daily broadsheet publication that's described as the national newspaper of Russia. In this interview, the Belarusian president touched on many current political flashpoints, including the war in Ukraine, the fate of BRICS, and even his own presidency, which the West doesn't recognize as legitimate. However, the part of the interview that arguably made the most noise came when Lukashenko was asked about the union state between Russia and Belarus, its prospects and challenges. Lukashenko initially approached this question with a certain level of restraint, choosing his words carefully. He described the union state as a house that must be built from the foundation. He also made a reference to the two countries' shared century-old history and common fatherland, as he called it, from Brest to Vladivostok. The first hint at what was coming came when Lukashenko said that there were actually two states in the Union State, two sovereign states. The sovereign part was no accident. He continued emphasizing the importance of sovereignty for both nations. "We are dependent on each other, but we are still two separate countries," Lukashenko declared, emphasizing that no matter how deep the ties ran, they would not lose their national identities. And this wasn't just a diplomatic message. It was a direct rebuttal to any suggestion that Belarus should be absorbed into Russia. But Lukashenko's insistence on Belarus's sovereignty didn't stop there. He made it clear that Belarus wasn't a satellite state, as some might imagine, nor would it ever become one. He reminded the interviewers that Belarus had been the initiator of the Union State, dating back to Boris Yeltsin's time, and all this union aimed to do was foster deeper economic and defense cooperation, not erase any borders. The more Lukashenko continued, the more animated he became, shedding any pretense of diplomacy. Then he stopped, mincing words. "This isn't the Middle Ages, where you seize a territory, collect taxes, and all is well," he said. "The world has changed. It's different now." Lukashenko's frustration with the idea grew more apparent as he pressed on, insisting that the geopolitical realities of the 21st century couldn't be ignored. His tone grew sharper. Lukashenko referred to the notion of territorial expansion without devastating consequences as a stupid goal. And according to Lukashenko, neither he nor Putin are stupid people. He even pointed to Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine as a prime example of why such ambitions are misguided. "You can conquer today, but what comes next? Constant guerrilla warfare, terrorist attacks? There's simply no point in living in constant fear." Though he was talking about Russia's plans for Ukraine, it's abundantly clear that he also had Belarus in mind. If you're still skeptical that Lukashenko would publicly challenge Putin in such a bold manner, consider the following quotes. When discussing a formal integration into Russia, the Belarusian president declared that the idea was impossible and unrealistic. He then added, "I'm sorry to say, that would mean war." And there it is, a hard line drawn in the sand. A clear and public rejection of any further Russian expansion into Belarus. And Lukashenko's stance wasn't just a personal belief, it was backed by the people of Belarus. He firmly stated that no one had given him the mandate to pursue a closer union in the form of integration. Any move in that direction would be quashed by the Belarusian people, he affirmed, referring to those people as loyal, reliable, and honest. So for Lukashenko and his people, the sovereignty of Belarus is non-negotiable. His interview with Izvestia was a man sending a message to Moscow: respect Belarus's independence or face the consequences. Now, you might wonder where all this talk about Russia absorbing Belarus is even coming from. Is it just paranoia, or perhaps a just-in-case response to Russia's growing influence? Neither one exactly. There's something more concrete behind the talk of Russia absorbing Belarus. In fact, there's an official blueprint for it. In 2023, a leaked Russian document detailed Moscow's concrete plans to gradually absorb Belarus into its fold by 2030. That's just a few years down the road. The internal paper revealed Russia's long-term strategy for unifying the two countries, a strategy that's been a long time in the making. As far back as April 2021, Russia had already started positioning its forces near the Belarus-Ukraine border, in what was seen as a precursor to the invasion of Ukraine. The plan was clear. Belarus was supposed to be the next in line after Ukraine fell. Of course, as we now know, this didn't happen. Ukraine is very much still standing. However, the leaked document further solidified suspicions that Russia's ambitions were far from limited to Ukraine. It wasn't just about taking back what Russia considered historically Russian lands. It was about reshaping borders and consolidating power under a new Russian empire. Interestingly, the strategy for Belarus mirrored Russia's plans for Ukraine, with Putin's invasion of subjugating both countries under Moscow's control. As one Western intelligence source pointed out, everything in the Kremlin's playbook for Belarus would have been executed once Ukraine was defeated and brought under Moscow's thumb. With this in mind, let's take a closer look at the playbook. Let's start with an important question. How do we even know about it? Well, the plan to absorb Belarus was leaked by an international consortium of journalists, with major outlets like Yahoo News and Germany's Süddeutsche Zeitung leading the charge. Ukraine's Kyiv Independent and the Belarusian Investigative Center were also involved. But these news organizations didn't just pull the information out of the ether, they went to great lengths to verify the authenticity of the document. They consulted analysts and experts who confirmed that the document was, indeed, legitimate. Even an unnamed Western official confirmed that the plan was prepared by the Presidential Directorate for Cross-Border Cooperation, a subdivision set up by Putin's administration back in 2018 specifically for strategies involving Belarus, Ukraine, and several other neighboring states. And when we say strategies, we mean finding ways to exert control over the neighboring countries. The Presidential Directorate is chaired by a high-ranking Kremlin official, Alexei Filatov, who directly reports to Dmitry Kozak, the Deputy Kremlin Chief of Staff. Filatov's team was given the monumental task of mapping out Russia's strategic goals for Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and the Baltic states, with contributions from the full range of Russia's power structures. This means that the leaked plan for Belarus wasn't a small-scale operation. According to sources, Russian intelligence services and the military had their hands all over this document. The Federal Security Service, or the FSB, the Foreign Intelligence Service, or the SVR, the General Staff of the Armed Forces, the Main Directorate of the General Staff, or the GRU, they all contributed. So we're talking about input from some of the highest levels of the Kremlin. The finalized plan was reportedly presented to Kozak in the fall of 2021, confirming that this wasn't just a vague idea, but a concrete strategy, years in the making. So what have the most brilliant minds from the Kremlin managed to come up with together? The 17-page internal paper essentially outlines a calculated, multi-pronged approach to bring Belarus into a so-called union state. According to the paper, the process isn't only political. It would also involve military, economic, and cultural integration, effectively ensuring Belarus becomes a satellite state under Moscow's complete influence. Now, the idea of a union state between Russia and Belarus is by no means new. As we've already mentioned, it dates back to the time of Yeltsin, the first president of the Russian Federation. The union state was first introduced as a concept in the mid-1990s and formalized by a treaty in 1999. However, it's never been fully realized. After Putin rose to power, the treaty largely languished on the shelf, where it stayed for nearly 2 decades. Then came the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. With Putin's increasing assertiveness in the region, the concept of a union state was also revived. Putin and Lukashenko signed agreements laying the groundwork for 28 integration programs, focusing on economic and military matters, but notably avoiding the sensitive issue of complete political fusion. Well, the leaked document picks up right where these arguments left off, pushing for a gradual but total absorption. The document is divided into 3 specific timelines: short-term by 2022, mid-term by 2025, and long-term by 2030. The 2022 goals were foundational, focusing on strengthening pro-Russian influence within Belarus's political, military, and societal structures. A key component was the creation of pro-Russian sentiments within both Belarus's political and military elites, as well as the general populace. Sounds familiar, right? Besides ramping up Russian influences, this document also underscores the importance of reducing nationalist and pro-Western forces in Belarus, a nod to Russia's long-standing concert with Belarusian sovereignty. To this end, the document also calls for constitutional reforms in Belarus to align more closely with Russian priorities, particularly in foreign and defense policies. These efforts culminated in Belarus's February 2022 referendum, which saw constitutional amendments that removed the country's neutrality status, among other things. As many as 82.9% of voters, over 4.4 million people, voted in favor of these amendments, which marked a significant shift in favor of Russian interests. Then we move on to midterm goals. By 2025, Russia's strategy hoped to deepen its influence across key sectors of Belarusian society. The document calls for the creation of sustainable pro-Russian groups of influence within the Belarusian political, military, and business communities. Again, this mirrors tactics previously used by Russia in other regions, where it fostered loyal elites who could act as intermediaries for Moscow's agendas. One of the most crucial steps in this phase is the expansion of Russia's military presence in Belarus. This would include both increasing the number of Russian military bases in the country and integrating Belarus's armed forces more closely into the Russian military apparatus. The latter can only be made possible through a joint command structure for Russian and Belarusian forces, so that's precisely what the document envisions. It also envisions increasing the number of Russian weapons depots stationed in Belarus. This would allow Russia to control Belarus's defense strategy while positioning its forces closer to NATO's eastern flank, especially in the context of Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine. Such a presence would undoubtedly have far-reaching implications for the security landscape of the region, particularly for neighboring NATO countries like Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. And that's just the military aspect. The strategy also outlined steps to simplify the process of issuing Russian passports to Belarusian citizens, a tactic that's been employed in other territories like Crimea, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. The so-called passportization is nothing but a way to establish legal claims over populations, making it easier to justify military intervention or annexation. The introduction of a single currency, likely the Russian ruble, was also a key part of this phase, a part that would further tie Belarus's economy to Russia's. Belarus has long been dependent on Russia for energy, with the country importing significant amounts of gas and oil. According to the International Energy Agency, a staggering 90% of the total energy imports in Belarus come from Russia. Though there are plans to reduce this dependency to 70% by 2035, Russia has the opposite goal: to deepen energy integration. This includes potential control over Belarus's energy infrastructure, such as its nuclear power plants and pipelines, and redirecting Belarusian trade from the Baltic ports to Russian ports. And this is just the beginning. By 2030, the Russian strategy envisions the full integration of Belarus into a new Russian empire under the banner of the Union State. In addition to political and military domination, which the previous phases tackled, the long-term goals concern cultural and ideological assimilation. According to the leaked document, Russia aims to create a single cultural space and a common approach to the interpretation of history. Translation: Russia wants to erase the distinct Belarusian identity. Central to this erasure is the promotion of the Russian language at the expense of Belarusian, a process that has already made significant inroads, as the former is widely spoken across the country. In fact, over 40% of the country's population sees Russian as their mother tongue, according to Belarus's National Statistical Committee. But having Russian being spoken widely isn't the goal. The end goal is for Russian to become the sole language of instruction and media, completely aligning Belarus with Russian cultural and political narratives. The strategy also calls for the establishment of Russian-affiliated non-governmental organizations and cultural centers across Belarus. These would have a single goal: to foster Russian influence on Belarusian civil society. They would be just another piece of the overall Russification puzzle, aimed at creating a society where Belarusian nationalism is suppressed and Russian identity is promoted. Of course, this couldn't be achieved without some good old propaganda. Russia's propaganda machine, fueled by state-controlled media and internet manipulation, has been a significant tool for consolidating power both domestically and in neighboring countries. That's why the document also stresses the importance of controlling the information space. In practice, this would mean replacing independent or pro-Western voices with pro-Kremlin narratives that justify Belarus's gradual merger with Russia. The ultimate goal: reshape the public opinion entirely. If all these strategies were to come to fruition, Belarus would cease to exist as an independent state. It would be nothing more than the vassal of Moscow, subject to Putin's every whim. Russia would also become immediate neighbors with Lithuania and Poland in the east, which has serious implications for NATO and Europe altogether. So it goes without saying that no one outside the Russian borders is particularly thrilled about Moscow's plans. Once the internal document was made public, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the Belarusian opposition leader who lives in exile, slammed the idea of the Union State, labeling it a threat for the Belarusian people and Belarusian statehood. She added that such a state wouldn't be a union of equals, but a roadmap for the absorption of Belarus by Russia. And if such absorption were to happen, Belarus could bid farewell to any semblance of democracy, a path that Tikhanovskaya and other Belarusian opposition leaders have been fighting hard to secure. But what about Lukashenko? What was his reaction to the leaked document? Speaking with local journalists at a sporting event, the Belarusian president dismissed this report as an attempt to divide Russia and his country. However, he didn't deny the legitimacy of the document. In fact, he claimed that such a document might have been crafted 3 years ago by a group of people in Putin's administration. For his part, he reiterated that he sees Belarus as an independent and sovereign state. Now, was this reaction truthful, or was it merely a carefully orchestrated performance? The latter seems more plausible. After all, Lukashenko has been trying to balance his reliance on Putin with his insistence on Belarusian sovereignty for years. Before the war in Ukraine, Lukashenko would often push back against Russia, using rhetoric and minor policy shifts to emphasize Belarus's independence. He managed to position Belarus as a unique bridge between Russia and the West, sometimes leveraging this status for economic concessions from Moscow. But the events of 2020 changed everything. Lukashenko's contested re-election led to widespread protests and condemnation from the West. As a result, Lukashenko found himself politically isolated and dependent on Putin's support to maintain his grip on power. As Sikhanovskaya remarked, "If it were not for Putin, Lukashenko would not have survived." This reliance translated into a gradual erosion of Belarusian autonomy, with Russia beginning to assert more control over Belarus's political and economic spheres. At the same time, Belarus stopped balancing Western and Russian interests and became a full-on Russian ally. This allyship became increasingly evident as tensions escalated with Ukraine. Russia deployed troops in Belarus for joint military drills, but these troops lingered past their scheduled departure date. In hindsight, this was a clear indication of Belarus's role in Russian strategic planning for the invasion. As tensions with Ukraine continue to grow, Belarus's value to Moscow took on a new dimension. You see, from the Belarus-Ukraine border, it's a mere 140 miles to reach Ukraine's capital. This geographical proximity to Kyiv offered a direct and strategically advantageous route for any potential military incursions. Russian troops, aircraft, and heavy artillery positioned in Belarus send a clear message about Moscow's intention to use this route, and that's precisely what it did. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Belarus became an essential launchpad, giving Russian forces easy access to Kyiv from the north. This also made Belarus a de facto participant in the war. Missile systems were stationed in Belarus, firing into Ukrainian territory. Air bases supported Russian aerial sorties. Belarusian infrastructure served as a supply route for Russian soldiers. In other words, Belarus was all in. Well, almost all in. You see, Lukashenko refrained from directly deploying Belarusian troops to Ukraine, likely aware that this move could destabilize his rule. Why? Because popular sentiment in Belarus wasn't in favor of direct involvement in Ukraine, and the Belarusian population made this fact well known. There were numerous instances of sabotage against Belarusian infrastructure, such as over 80 attacks on railway lines used by Russian forces since April 2022, which reminded Lukashenko that the public wasn't unanimously behind him in supporting Russia. Lukashenko seemingly heard this message loud and clear, and his rhetoric reflected it. He repeatedly assured Belarusians that the nation would only engage in self-defense if attacked. He stuck to his promise even when Putin started demanding Belarusian soldiers, repeatedly delaying any formal commitment to join the fight. By 2023, however, Belarus's dependency on Russia deepened even further. Following the 2022 referendum that removed Belarus's nuclear-free status, Putin announced plans to station tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, marking a significant escalation. Russian ambassador to Belarus Boris Gryzlov later confirmed that these weapons would be stationed in western Belarus, close to NATO borders, heightening tensions in the region. This move was also seen as a definitive signal that Belarus has relinquished any pretense of neutrality. Some Western analysts went as far as declaring Belarus a puppet state under Russian influence. However, Lukashenko did send periodic signals that he preferred to avoid direct involvement in the conflict, and we aren't just talking about refusing to send the Belarusian troops. For instance, when a Ukrainian missile accidentally landed in Belarus in December 2022, the country's state media remained quiet on the incident. In other words, they chose not to escalate tensions despite being handed a prime opportunity to frame it as an attack and retaliate. However, Lukashenko's rhetoric didn't change. In February 2023, he stated that Belarus would join Russia in fighting if Belarusian territory were invaded. In September 2024, once nuclear weapons were fully in the picture, he added that an attack on Belarus would equal World War III. The arrival of tactical nuclear weapons, along with the training of Russian conscripts and Wagner mercenaries on Belarusian soil, transformed Belarus into an indispensable military outpost for Russia. Naturally, neighboring countries like Poland and Lithuania have perceived this transformation as a threat, strengthening their military defenses in response. Belarus has also focused on its own military defenses, strengthening its troop presence along the Ukrainian border. Reportedly, nearly a third of Belarus's entire armed forces are now stationed at this border. Considering that Belarus has around 60,000 troops in total, 48,000 in the professional army and 12,000 in the State Border Committee, this is quite a move. The same goes for heavy artillery and air defense systems. Though these moves were framed as defensive measures, they obviously reflect a deepening alignment with Russian objectives. Throw the active collaboration of Belarusian soldiers in logistical roles into the mix, and it becomes abundantly clear that Belarus's autonomy has been sacrificed on the altar of Russian security needs to some extent. With the Union State Agreement's framework increasingly coming to fruition, Lukashenko stands at a crossroads. Road number one leads to a full integration with Russia, a plan that has only been slowed down by the war in Ukraine, not halted. Russia's tactics to achieve this plan may have softened at times to avoid destabilizing Belarus, but the pressure remains constant. As for road number 2, it's one that would require Lukashenko to actively resist Russia's influence to maintain Belarusian sovereignty. Should he choose this road, the Belarusian president would likely face internal challenges, as well as economic repercussions imposed by Russia, and that's not to mention the wrath of Putin, who's increasingly becoming more erratic. With both paths laid out like this, it becomes clear why Serhiy Kyslytsya, permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, referred to Lukashenko's predicament as Catch-22. So, what do you say? Does Lukashenko have any real room to maneuver, or is he doomed to continue as a pawn in Putin's geopolitical game? Will he ever break free from Russia's grasp, or is Belarus inexorably bound to become part of a greater Russian empire? Share your predictions in the comments section below. Now go and check out Spain has had enough of Russia, get out of Ukraine, or click this other video instead.